This video is sponsored by Make Nashville, but more on them later. Part 1 of this miter station build series will cover the general construction, fancy drawer labels, and super satisfying drawer organizers. On Combs design. This is my old miter saw station, and there's nothing really wrong with it, it's just not as efficient as it could be. One of my favorite features was this removable fence that allowed me to open up this miter saw station to workspace, so I'm going to incorporate something like that in this build. I used 12 sheets of 3/4 inch plywood, and it was a lot to break down. When breaking down large sheets of plywood, there will be some cuts that you simply can't make on the table saw. What I do to maintain accuracy is rough cut everything oversized with a circular saw, and then when I have pairs of items, like the sides of a cabinet for example, I clamp them together and cut them at the same time. The measurement will be pretty close, but more importantly, the pair will have the exact same measurements. For the cuts that I can make on the table saw, I simply cut everything a little oversized and then bring it down to its final dimension on the table saw. I had a lot of pieces when I was done breaking down this lumber. My first step was marking out and cutting the toe kick that is on the cabinets. This is just a little 2" by 2" recess that's a aesthetic feature that's on the bottom of the cabinets. For any shop furniture, I always use pocket holes and wood glue for my construction. If you've watched any of my furniture builds, you know that I typically won't use this for any piece of furniture that I make out of hardwood. The advantage of using glue and screws here is that you don't have to wait for any glue to dry and things don't have to sit in clamps. When working on shop projects, the goal is to be able to get what you need built in the shop and then move on to your real projects. Using screws lets the process go faster and keep going so you can knock out these large projects with less time for glue cure. I'm doing a double laminated top of plywood, so I'm currently screwing the top directly into my upright plywood pieces. If this was my finished top, I wouldn't attach my pieces like this, however, there will be another plywood panel going on the top. In part 2 of this build series, you'll see exactly why I do that. With the general carcass of the cabinet done, I moved on to cutting my pieces and cutting my dados for my drawer box construction. The sides of all my drawers were made out of 3/4 inch plywood, and I used 1/2 inch material for the drawer bottoms. Just like the carcass, I used glue and screw construction to knock out all 18 of these drawers rather quickly. I place all of my pocket holes so the ones on the front will be covered by the drawer front, and the ones in the back will never be seen because it's the back of the drawer box. With this method, I was able to knock out a drawer box in about 10 to 15 minutes, which, if you've built drawers before, you know is pretty quick. I made some custom spacers to make lining up my drawer slides a lot easier. I have 2 sets. One is to space the actual drawer slides away from each other, and then I have a second set with an L-shaped top to catch the drawer. These are a 1/2 inch shorter than the drawer slide spacers. This way the drawer box can sit on it, you can attach the slides, and it makes the process of putting all the drawers together super easy. It's not obvious from this shot, but I used this Craig drawer hardware spacing jig to place all of my drawer front holes. At this point, I'm not drilling all the way through the drawer. I just drill through the drawer front and I can attach the drawer front to the drawer with screws. I can then pull the drawer out and attach it permanently with screws from the inside and then put the handle on later. If that was confusing or didn't make sense, you'll have another opportunity to see this in more detail later on. I applied 3 coats of Total Boat's Halcyon finish, and this is a quick drying, super durable finish that I'm really loving for shop projects. I essentially rinsed and repeat for my 4 cabinet carcasses and put everything in place against the wall. You can kind of see the general frame taking shape. I also made these little half drawers that are for my expendable cabinet. This allows me to stack expendables in my expendable cabinet and pull them out so nothing gets lost in the back forever. I guess these could have just been true drawers, but I like this aesthetic better. You will find free plans in the link below. This is a SketchUp file that you can either use to copy this entire miter station, or you can edit it and make one your own, custom to your exact needs. I made another half drawer, and instead of a drawer front, attached a cabinet front so I could have this nice pull-out trash can. The ones you buy at the store are extremely overpriced, and this was cheaper and more efficient in my opinion. I used another Kreg jig to drill out the recesses for the cabinet hinge hardware. There are a ton of videos on how to install cabinet doors, and that's a whole art to itself, so I won't really get into it in detail here. I am in love with this next feature. It's a hidden air reel, so I have air available to me at all times. I got a new air compressor that we'll talk about a little bit later, and this stays connected to it all the time. I made a front panel for this where the hose can come out, and you'll see here in a minute that I also recess a magnet, so the metal end of the air hose can just clip to the magnet, and I always have the hose available. I'll use magnets a lot throughout this project. The roundover you saw me put on the hole for the hose is simply to prevent chip out over time with lots of use. I addressed the electrical next. Now, I'm no electrician, so I'm not going to get really in depth here, but I'm very confident with my electrical skills, and I'm not afraid to do this type of work. If this is something that scares you, hire a pro. It's a lot better to spend the money than wonder if your electrical is correct. Early on, I was using some single gang boxes for this build, and I swapped those out to 2 gang boxes off camera, because once I got everything in the box, it simply wasn't fitting. Here's one of those 2 gang boxes. I ran 12 gauge wire through my electrical conduit and got everything hooked up. For the drop that's at the miter saw, I installed one of these switches that turns the vacuum on when the miter saw is on. We'll address this in detail in part 2 of this series. In all, I have 7 drops in different places across this miter station. With the electrical done, I put my new air compressor in place. I am just in love with this. It is so much quieter than my old air compressor. How much quieter? Glad you asked. In my tests, my quiet, husky air compressor started up at around 95 decibels and averaged out around 90 decibels. And in comparison, the California Air Tools compressor started up around 72 decibels and averaged out around 70 decibels. That's a huge difference, and not just in the numbers, but also in the perceived sound levels. The Husky air compressor is very aggressive and in your face, and by comparison, the California Air Tools compressor is really mellow and just falls into the background of your shop noise floor. With that settled, I headed over to Make Nashville, and that's where the fun part of this video begins. I used one of their CNCs to cut recesses in all my drawer fronts. I cut a main recess for a label template, and then a smaller recess for a magnet. You'll see how these pair together in a minute. While the CNC is making all these cuts, consider hitting subscribe. That's the best way you can help me continue to make free content on YouTube. After I cut out all the recesses, I cut the exact opposite shape, which is the template for the label itself. I had a little problem with dust collection here, as you can see, and that was completely my fault. So, sorry, Make Nashville. I took all my label templates over to the laser, and I began engraving different text for my different drawer labels. This provides a really clean and professional drawer label, but because they're interchangeable, I can make new labels whenever I need to on the laser and pop them in and out as my needs change or if I move my drawers around. I applied the same finish that I put on the cabinets, and I let those sit and dry. The next day, I headed back to Make Nashville and began cutting my custom drawer cutouts. Now, I'll be honest with you, this took weeks of prototyping and figuring out how I wanted to make these exact to my tool shapes. If you want to see a video on exactly how I did it, let me know below in the comments. On these, I didn't want to try to line anything up with a laser, so I used an engraving bit and backfilled it with paint. To backfill, you see that I simply covered everything with paint and then sanded off the top layer, leaving the paint in the recess. On the drawer fronts, I glued in magnets much like I did with the air hose, and then on the labels that go in the drawer fronts, I drilled a hole on my drill press and used super glue to hold the magnet in place. I would typically use epoxy, but this will be fine for this application. Also, be sure to ensure that the polarity of your magnets is correct. This is how I install drawer fronts, now that everything's done. I used the drawer handle holes in the front to put some screws through and temporarily hold them to the drawer box. I'm then able to screw in my drawer box from the back side. Finally, I can remove the first 2 screws and apply the drawer hardware. With the magnet labels sitting how I want them to, I was able to put in my custom drawer inserts. These were super satisfying to fill with tools, and you'll see in some inserts I did exact custom fit pieces, and in others I did general shapes. I love organization and I'm really OCD about it, so this is great for me and how my mind works. To maximize space, I also made these 2-layer drawer organizers. First, you can put your bottom layer insert in place. Next, you put some simple runners built with either plywood or MDF in the middle, and then you put your second layer on top. I typically make my second layer a half or a third of the size so I can slide it back and forth to easily access everything. If you don't have a CNC, you can also make dividers with plywood or MDF. I've done many cabinets like this, and if you want to see a specific video for a more complicated divider built with this method, let me know down below. This build took a long time and even more planning, but I'm super happy with how it's coming along so far. I still need to make some small tweaks on my drawer reveals, but I'll get to that in a later video. This was so much work and there's still so much more to do. Hit subscribe and stick around for part 2 of this build where I will install a router table and a miter track. In later parts, I'll also show you the installation of the miter saw and a vise. I will also be integrating a 3D printer into this setup and using that printer to print organizers for all of my hardware. This is a big undertaking and a lot of printing, but that video is coming soon. I still have a lot of work ahead of me, but I'm looking forward to the final product. I've made so much progress, and I hope you learned something or maybe got a new creative idea for your miter saw station from this video. Thank you guys so much, and I will catch you guys on the next episode of Combs Design.